We'll get right to the big news this morning. The president and his allies are celebrating Robert Mueller's report on Russia's interference in the 2016 election. Attorney General William Barr writes in his 4-page summary of the report that the special counsel did not find that any U.S. person or Trump campaign official or associate conspired or knowingly coordinated with Russia in Russia's efforts to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Barr also writes that Mueller reached no conclusion on whether the president obstructed justice. Barr, quoting the special counsel's report on the issue of obstruction, writes, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. The Attorney General writes that Mueller provided him with the facts of the obstruction case and left it up to the AG to decide if the president obstructed justice. Barr writes, quote, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein and I have concluded that the evidence developed during the special counsel's investigation is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. A senior DOJ official tells NBC News that Barr did not consult with Mueller about his summary. When asked about the summary, the special counsel's office said, quote, we're not commenting.
All right, so Ari, let's break this down. First of all, something that everybody's going to know 6 months from now is the Mueller report is far different from the Barr letter. Already from people that I've been speaking with, there's a great difference between the Barr letter and the Mueller report. And yet, everybody right now is, again, just let's be concise here, they're talking about William Barr's letter, his summary of a massive, sweeping investigation, the contents of which nobody knows.
That's absolutely right. And whatever is in the Mueller report, enough of it goes against the Barr letter that he felt the need to include this non-exoneration language. He felt the need to include that there is private, unreported information about acts by the president that went in the obstruction section. He felt the need to include that for some reason, perhaps because it comes out later or because he needed to balance what the Barr letter does, which goes beyond, by definition, the Mueller report.
Yeah, so tell me, why would Mueller take such a firm position on obstruction, but not on, or why wouldn't he take a firmer position on obstruction as he did on collusion?
Well, I think on collusion, you're looking at potential conspiracy involving multiple people. That's what conspiracies are. And so he didn't find one or more Americans were on the other side of what the Russians did in a chargeable way. No chargeable collusion. Huge finding, huge headline. We saw the signs of that as soon as Friday when he finished his probe without those indictments. On obstruction by a president, that is usually in the ballpark of either it is or isn't a high crime. It's something the House decides. Watergate is an example where the House was moving towards viewing the president's act as obstructive, and it was the House deciding that, not the actual special prosecutor. The Watergate roadmap, Joe, was famously about facts and findings, not making that decision for the House Judiciary Committee or anyone else.
Right. And so you also obviously have Congress now going to be trying to get the material, trying to figure out what's in there. There's certainly precedent for them subpoenaing the material and getting it because of what Republicans did with Hillary Clinton's 302s. Is that going to happen here? And when they get that material, what are they going to find?
Number one, I think that's where the big fight goes. All of this was always about whenever
you say that's a big fight. The president, though, said release it all on Friday. The Republicans and the Democrats voted unanimously to release the entire report. They're already on record saying that, right?
This is what I think is shaping up as a clever strategy, and that's what it looks like, a good cop, bad cop. So Donald Trump Jr. says release it all. Donald Trump Sr., the president, says release it, and I told the House to have that happy vote. Meanwhile, Barr, who works in the Trump administration, is the one speeding a process. I mean, this was a very quick weekend process to issue big, sweeping conclusions about a 22-month investigation's findings, but now a very slow, what appears to be a slower process to release the report itself. And that, again, goes to something very important here. We don't know why Bob Mueller wrote the obstruction section the way he did. And it's not for us to put ourselves in place of Bob Mueller because we don't know. What we do know is that Barr has decided to release certain things very quickly and other things not. And when you look at the first page of that letter, it tells us that there were 500 witness interviews. It tells us there were 2,800 subpoenas. It tells us all sorts of interesting things that actually get closer, not to sources and methods, but to the scope of the probe. You know what it doesn't tell us, Joe? How many pages was this report that Barr spent the weekend reading?
We don't even know that.
If it was 30 pages, perhaps it would look much more reasonable. If it was 300.
Right.
Well, that was a quick weekend with just
read.
a skeletal
Yeah.
staff. And so, again, I think Barr has obviously reinforced what was a key finding that's good for Trump, no matter how you slice it, no chargeable collusion. But Barr has also now taken this and made it all about the Barr letter,
Right.
and he's clearly being selective. Now, some will say they support that. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Michael Schmidt again, a guy who was skeptical of this probe from the very beginning, a guy who basically was fishing for a job from Donald Trump from the very beginning. You don't just write those memos and go, oh, by the way, Mr. President, here's something you would like very much. It did the trick, just like Whitaker going on TV did the trick to make him acting AG. But it's very interesting. You had a comment yesterday where you said, well, okay, you appoint a special counsel because you want to take politics out of the case. He does this investigation. They take politics out of the case. But then they have two DOJ appointed officials, political officials, making this determination on collusion and obstruction.
So Mueller goes out, makes his, collusion decision, has this, whatever he comes to on obstruction, and then the politicos are the ones who say, no, we don't think the president broke the law. Then what was Mueller? Part of my understanding of why they wanted Mueller there was to make a decision that the public would say, okay, we feel really confident in this, that someone went out and followed the facts, someone who could stand there and make a tough call wherever the facts were. And in the end, it's Barr and Rosenstein who make the call.
Barr make that call over a weekend after we had this 2-year investigation when he had to know there would be a political firestorm?
I still don't understand. I think he will have to explain more of what was really behind that, because the other thing in the letter that I didn't understand is he says, well, one of the key facts is that we didn't find that there was an underlying crime, that there was no, when we looked at all this stuff, there was nothing to obstruct. When a special counsel is appointed, it's usually not the issue that they're looking at that becomes the problem for the person under investigation. It's something else. Mm-hmm. Well, in this case, what was an outgrowth of this? The case in New York, where the president has essentially been named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the payments for the Stormy Daniels payments. So what was the president thinking in May and June and July of 2017, where he's saying, Bob Mueller better not look at my finances. Right. Bob Mueller better not look at my money. And what comes out of Bob Mueller? The president's an unindicted co-conspirator in New York.
I've got to say, too, Mika, Mr. Barr, as the New York Times pointed out yesterday, has a very curious view of obstruction. So since there was an underlying crime, there can be no obstruction. That's not the standard. You still have people that can be found guilty of perjury if they're lying to the court. The purpose for obstruction is to make sure that investigations can move forward without people lying and getting in their way.
And we don't know what's actually in the report. The big battle. Benjamin Wittes, of course, will be actually seeing the report in its entirety. But this is Barr's interpretation of Mueller's report, made quickly over the weekend. What major questions and most important facts stand out to you?
All right, so the first most important fact is that he did not substantiate the underlying collusion allegation. And the key question there is how unsubstantiated is it in the underlying report? Is this an example where they investigated it and they found that it didn't happen? Mm-hmm. Is this a situation where they investigated it and they came 2 inches short of a prosecutorial case, given a many hundred-page or many dozen-page discussion of this, whatever that answer is? That's a huge difference.
Well, and as as Lawfare said, it doesn't mean they didn't behave recklessly, foolishly, or unpatriotically. We don't have that information. We don't have the politically embarrassing information that is contained in this report, the damning information that's contained in this report. And for people that are watching, they do need to understand there are a lot of things that can happen that come short of the standard of a prosecutor saying, okay, I'm going to move forward on charges.
Right. It is consistent with the Barr letter for that underlying report to say, we found that there was no collusion. It is also consistent with the Barr letter for that report to say, we found that we could not bring a case because we had clear and convincing evidence of collusion, but not proof beyond a reasonable doubt of collusion. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is this issue you guys have been discussing about the obstruction. Robert Mueller clearly found that there was substantial evidence of obstruction. He clearly found that there was a plausible case to bring on a variety of possible obstructions because he, as Barr describes, he describes the conduct and he evaluates the pros and cons of bringing an obstruction case, of treating it as an obstruction, but then concludes that he shouldn't make a traditional prosecutorial judgment. The question is, why should he not make a traditional prosecutorial judgment there in his mind? Why should he not evaluate it along a traditional criminal axis?
And you just have to ask a question, David Ignatius, what's the rush? I mean, he just got this material, this voluminous material. There is no reason other than political reasons to rush, and within 36 hours, 36 hours of getting this entire report, actually looking at what Robert Mueller said, who said there's very concerning information here, balancing it. We haven't been able to come to a conclusion. But moving it on to the Attorney General.
Joe, you can see reasons why Barr would have wanted to move quickly to send out a letter that explained to Congress and the country the basics of what Mueller had concluded. There's a separate question. He was asked to make a judgment that Mueller wasn't prepared to make about obstruction, and that's where the rush.
No, we don't know that he was asked to do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the implication is that
not really.
Mueller.
Not really. The letter, I have to say, having studied the letter and covering this all night, the letter does not assert that Mueller asked him to make that judgment. The letter doesn't even claim that. And that's an important distinction. What the letter says is Mueller didn't reach that judgment. Well, in the Clinton case, which was under a different statutory power, but just to put it simply for people, we didn't do the whole Starr investigation and then have Janet Reno decide whether there was obstruction. In the Nixon case, we didn't go through two special prosecutors and then have Mitchell decide whether there was obstruction. In other words, everything we know about how this has always worked is that the cases that go to the obstructive or potential high crime territory, even if you clear a president, are done typically by whether the House wants to pursue impeachment and does the Senate want to have a trial, not typically by the AG. So the difference here seems to be Barr inserting himself. I'm not saying that means he's wrong. I'm just saying it's not what Mueller asked.
Mueller was appointed to reach a prosecutor decline to prosecute judgment on issues that arose in his investigation. And I can't help but think that he ducked the latter half of that. He stepped up to the collusion issue. He defined what he reading from Barr's account, to define what he thought collusion meant here, working with this very professional intelligence operation run from Moscow. But on obstruction, he wouldn't make the decision that I think he was charged to make.
But you know that he has to abide by DOJ rules, which say that he, like any other prosecutor, does not indict a sitting president. So given that, it is not, I don't think, the most reasonable inference of a letter that's about a report we haven't seen that Mueller was deciding whether or not to break DOJ policy and indict the sitting president. Everything we know about the rules goes in the other direction.
I agree with that. I think what we know is that Mueller didn't make the judgment. We don't know whether Barr insinuated himself into the situation and made the judgment or arrogated it to himself to make the judgment. And we don't know whether Mueller declined to make the judgment because, for example, he thought the decision was too hard and he was punting, or because he was laying out a record for adjudication by Congress, which is what I suspect the reality is.
Benjamin, here's the deal, though. This is what makes no sense. I'm a dumb country lawyer here, right? I think
the last refuge is counsel.
I think this is dictated where Robert Barr's position is this: you cannot indict a sitting president, right? So if his position is you cannot indict a sitting president, then why is he drawing a conclusion on whether he can whether this president could be indicted, when what Robert Mueller was doing all along And people close to Mueller said all along he was gathering evidence to pass along to Congress to make that decision. Why would he even tip the scales if, at the end of the day, it was going to have no impact?
Okay, there was never, you're absolutely right, there is never a chance that Bob Mueller was going to indict Donald Trump while he remained in office. DOJ policy forbids it. Mueller was bound by that policy. He was going to observe it. The relevant question here is therefore not an operative question. It's just, is the Justice Department going to say that we think Donald Trump committed a crime to a standard that's provable beyond a reasonable doubt or not? Mueller clearly made the judgment, I am going to lay out the record and let other people make that determination.
And Ken Starr, Joe, Ken Starr to this day asserts that his report, while it presented overwhelming evidence of what he called obstruction, his report did not resolve this. In other words, if you believe Ken Starr, and people debate with him, the Ken Starr position is now also what Barr suggests the Mueller position is, which is amassing evidence but not rushing to take the place of the House when it comes to matters of potential high crimes.
So, Mike Barnacle, if the United States Congress is going to be making a determination on whether the President of the United States obstructed justice, which, of course, were articles of impeachment for both Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. If they're going to make that determination, they have to see the material that Robert Mueller has. So if William Barr is going to be holding these cards close to his chest, isn't he going to be getting in the way of what actually the entire purpose of the Mueller investigation was? To get information to Congress so they could make the decision.
That's correct, Joe. And we're not going to be able to talk about this knowledgeably, fully knowledgeably, until we see the report, until the American public sees the report. I was told yesterday by two people who know Bob Mueller very well and know aspects of this investigation. And both of them said you cannot overestimate the importance on the obstruction issue of Mueller's team being unable to get Trump to testify Q&A back and forth in private. Don't overestimate the importance of the absence of Trump's testimony, because Bob Mueller is a man of deep integrity, and to charge a president or anyone with obstruction of justice requires state of mind. We don't really know what Trump's state of mind was or is about all of the events that would give you strong suspicions that he did try to obstruct justice. We know about the tweets, those are public, but we don't know about his state of mind. Is the tweets reflective of his state of mind? And it's a very tough call to take that to court, because it's a high bar to convict someone of obstruction. I'd leave it to the legal experts on the panel to argue with that, but that's what I was told.
All right, Barbara McQuaid, I want you to weigh in overall on your reaction to the report. Again, we don't know how long the report is. We don't know what the facts are in the report that led to the one conclusion and the remaining question. And the question I have for you is the fact that this has been interpreted by Donald Trump's latest pick for Attorney General. What questions do you have? What areas are you concerned where you need to see the facts before ultimately you can make a conclusion to yourself in terms of obstruction of justice and any other issues that might be damaging to this president?
To me, the biggest question that Barr's letter raises is why on earth is he the one inserting himself and making this ultimate decision on obstruction of justice? The whole purpose for having a special counsel was to have an independent, objective viewpoint insulated from the chain of command so that the public could have confidence in the outcome here. It's as if Tom Brady has been your quarterback for the entire season and the entire Super Bowl, and for the very last play, Bill Belichick, the coach, comes in and says, I'm going to take this last play, stand down, Tom. What on earth is that all about? I mean, it appears that Robert Mueller found evidence on both sides with the idea that because a sitting president cannot be indicted, he just provided the evidence so that Congress could make that call. Why on earth is William Barr then inserting himself and making that decision? I think that raises a lot of questions, and I think that means that we really need to see as much as we can from this report so that the public can have confidence this was an appropriate decision.
So we were flashing a lot of headlines. We're going to go to break, and we're going to do a lot more of this after the break. But we showed the Dallas Morning News and showed some other newspapers. Some newspapers' headlines said, no collusion, no exoneration. And that's what I saw in a lot of news networks yesterday. But I want you to look at that headline. That's the headline that is going to cut through America today. You want to know what Americans are going to take away from this, regardless of what's said in the coming months? That's your headline. Report. No collusion.
Well, that's your headline, and the conversations to come are the political results of this headline. And this is a huge win, hands down, black and white, for President Trump. Absolutely.
Oh, listen, it is. It is. I will only say, I think it was either McMillan or Heath that said, in politics, a week is a lifetime.
Absolutely.
In Trump world, a day is an eternity. So you know, I would not run victory laps for Donald Trump yet. I would not sing death dirges for the Democratic Party yet, only because things move so fast in this administration. Much more to come. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.